Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about identity. In doing so, I am going to draw on my book with Cambridge, The Politics and Ethics of Identity. Identity is something that is central to the constructivist paradigm. It also seems very central to politics, beginning in the late 18th century with the rise of nationalism, which remains a strong identification for many people in many parts of the world. More recently, identity politics has become a common term, and conflicts in the cultural wars, much of them revolve around competing conceptions of identity. I want to make a radical claim here. There is no such thing as identity. I know that sounds very strange, and indeed when I make this argument to students in seminar, I get strange looks. I argue to them that they have a notion of the self which is a product of the romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th century, which has been bought lock, stock, and barrel by many modern people. They believe, as my students do, that they are unique, and moreover, that part of their agenda is to discover their uniqueness, to build on it, and to live up to the expectations and possibilities of that identity. I asked them to take out a piece of paper, not to put their name on it, but to write down what makes them unique. They hand it in. I read it out. By the time I get to the fourth or fifth student, it becomes perfectly clear that everybody is unique for more or less the same reasons. They're caring, they're thoughtful, they're imaginative, and they begin to laugh. There's always a bright student in the seminar who says, yes, but we are unique because we have different experiences. And I ask, well, how do you have access to those experiences? The answer is, of course, my memory. I give them the reading assignment for that week, which is some of the psychological literature on memory. It argues that it is a social construct, that people remake their memories over time to accord with their social and psychological needs, that they're deeply influenced in this sense by what goes on around them, especially by their peer groups. Well, if we don't have identities, what is it we have? I argue in this book that we are really a combination of numerous self-identifications, and also identifications that are imposed on us by the outside society, some of which we may accept, some of which we may not like at all and do our best to reject or overcome. Let me talk for the moment only about the self-identifications. They come from three sources. The first is our relationship with our body. Go through the thought experiment of putting yourself in the body of another gender. Now, admittedly, there are some people who feel they're trapped in the wrong body, but most of us are comfortable with our genders. And we find it very hard to imagine ourselves as the opposite. So our bodies tell us in part who we are, and in many important ways, not just with respect to gender. If you're feeling sick or out of sorts, you say, I'm not myself today. Again, an indication of the central role the body plays in our self-identifications. And it may well give you attributes, whether it's strength, beauty, or intelligence, that become central to your understanding of yourself. Secondly, and I'm not giving this in any order of importance, is affiliations. We all have affiliations of varying degrees of strength to our loved ones, to those we may care for or feel responsible for, to groups, institutions, countries, or broader categories of people. And these may be political, as identifications with states, for example, are, but they could be religious identifications, social identifications, sports identifications. If somebody comes up with a New York Yankee cap on and asks me who I am, I will immediately define myself as a member of the Red Sox nation. I, like many of you, have professional associations. I'm a political scientist, I'm a professor, I'm a graduate of a particular set of institutions, some of which I identify with, others of which I try very hard to distance myself from. So affiliations define who we are, and often in the eyes of other people as well. Then come our roles. We play a variety of roles in life. Some of these roles may help us define who we are, in part because we identify with them strongly, as I do with being a scholar and a professor. Others because so much of our life has been involved in playing this role that we of necessity think of ourselves in terms of it. And finally, we have histories. And these histories, as I noted a moment ago, are entirely socially constructed in terms of giving meaning as opposed to just describing things you've done. And these histories may not only be personal, they may embrace ethnic groups or collectivities of all different kinds. And we think of ourselves in terms of our membership, either explicit or implicit, as part of these groups. Overall, we therefore have a large number of identifications. And these identifications rise and fall in importance. First, as a function of priming. I already gave you the example of somebody wearing the New York Yankees hat. But also in terms of life experiences, changes in residence, jobs, partners, the relative importance of these identifications rises and falls over time. And so does their character. They are labile. They can be rewritten as to what they mean or what about them is important. We tend to think of ourselves as a representative whole, but in fact, we're this grab bag of multiple identifications, some of which are reinforcing, mutually reinforcing, but others of which are in conflict. I may feel that a student of mine is a friend, and I would like him or her to excel and do well in life, play my role as a professor. If they submit a paper which I don't think is as good as I'd like to see, I can't give them the kind of grade I would like. One example of a small conflict. Now, why do I mention this? I mention it because it's not just of psychological importance. Rather, beginning with the Romantic movement, but certainly followed by present-day Western clinical psychology, a number of philosophers, social scientists like Giddens, identities are supposed to provide guidance to us. Guidance not only in making political choices, but ethical ones. There's a close connection, allegedly, between our identity, who we are, and the kinds of behavior that we think are wise and acceptable. This doesn't really make sense. If we have no identity, but only this mass or collection of self-identifications that rise and fall in importance, that are very sensitive to context, to situation, to even to mood, they may well give us very different kinds of ethical and political directives, depending on which ones rise to the fore at any given moment. People know this. It's one reason why so much of politics is intended to get you to absorb certain kinds of identities, to define yourself in particular ways, and then to mobilize you on the basis of that to support particular political and social projects. It's a very efficacious way of building political support. This kind of politics is aimed not only at individuals, but at nations as a whole. So much of what culture wars are about in the West are attempts by different groups of people to impose different identifications on their country. In the United States, where I'm giving this talk in July of 2020, so an election is coming up in November, Donald Trump is trying very hard to mobilize a nativist identity, defining or appealing to people who have defined America as white and Christian. They, his audience, therefore see themselves as representing the real America and deserving of power, status, authority, more wealth. Believe that immigrants, non-whites, non-Christians, women are, if not inferior groups, secondary in their status and less deserving. By contrast, Biden and his running mate, Kamala Harris, are presenting a very different multi-ethnic America, America as an immigrant nation, America with a different sense of what its purpose is. So identities matter. They're important issues of politics. And those who succeed in gaining power are often politicians who are effective either in imposing particular identities on a state or in mobilizing people who identify with them by running particular kinds of campaigns. Now, I will return to the ethical dilemmas and prospects of identity in another talk. In the second part of this chat, I want to talk about what is particularly novel in my Politics of Identity book. By no means the first person to make the case that we delude ourselves in believing that we have an identity. My question is, why do so many people believe this? What happened in the modern era to bring this about? And I argue that two distinguishing features of modernity come into play. The first is interiority, and by interiority we mean a reflexive self, a sense that we all have that we can step back from whatever role we're playing and think about what we're doing. We can stand or float above ourselves and look down on our behavior and that of others as a kind of third party and think about it. People have always had an interior self, but for many reasons, interiority became far more pronounced in the modern era. If you compare tragedies of Shakespeare and Goethe with what went before them with Greek tragedy, you see an immediate difference. Greek characters were archetypes. They represented a combination of qualities. The tragedy was about how these qualities played out in practice. Shakespearean characters have inner selves. Think of Hamlet or Cordelia. It's their inner selves and their reflections on them that drive the plot and are the core to exploring humanity in the play. This is a big difference. There's a strong interactive effect between the literature and the project of identity building in practice. The two are synergistic. So reflexive selves became stronger and we feel more comfortable with having them. Secondly, we have a proliferation of roles in the modern world. In the pre-modern world, people had fairly limited range of roles, and they might play the same roles for all of their lives. In the modern world, we play multiple roles, and these change in the course of our lifetime. Some of these roles, like some of our identifications, are in conflict with one another. And if we have to behave in one way in a particular role, let's say you're a traffic cop during the afternoon, and a different way in another role that you play in the evening where, let's say, you're part of a social athletic group that meets, you will have a sense of being either cut up in pieces or forced to be different selves. And the recognition of this is brought about by your reflexive self. So the more you can think about it and see yourself as appearing superficially to be defined by your roles, the more you tend to ask yourself, well, who am I? Is there any me, any real me that lurks behind these roles that I might discover? Now, I'm going to stop here for the moment and leave you with the thought that this alienation and anxiety produced by the reflexive self and the proliferation of roles, some of them contradictory, brings about a strong need, psychological need by people to overcome this anxiety. And I will argue that modern identity projects are at their root a response to this problem.